which he did see. So was Dr. Don Curtis, who unbuttoned President Kennedy's bloody shirt and witnessed what he thought was a bullet wound in the president's throat. The next person to examine the president was this guy right here, Dr. Malcolm Perry. And Perry does something that's really going to mess things up a little bit. Okay? Dr. Malcolm Perry is an attending surgeon. He's just 34 years old. He's the next one to examine and work on President Kennedy. He's assisted by this guy right here, Robert McClellan. Robert McClellan. So Dr. Malcolm Perry's the next to see the president, and he is assisted by Dr. Robert McClellan. And what Malcolm Perry does to try to see if he can get the president to breathe is what? What do you do to get somebody to breathe? Well, no, not yet. A trach. And he cut the trach to try, and he did this because this is what you do. He cut the trach right over the bullet wound, which ruined evidence, which he wasn't concerned about. So Perry had performed the incision for the trach over the bullet wound in Kennedy's throat. Dr. McClellan held a retractor. And then what did Perry do? Began CPR. So Dr. Malcolm Perry first cuts a hole in the president's throat to insert a tube for a trach, covering up any evidence, unfortunately, but it wasn't any, criticism because he was trying to do what he could, and then performed CPR. As Perry began CPR on President Kennedy, he was able to raise what medically was reported as a semblance of a heartbeat. Semblance means what? Sound like it, maybe, okay? So Perry reports after the trach and the CPR that he was able to raise what he termed medically as a semblance of a heartbeat. In the meantime, this doctor right here, Ronald Jones, established an IV line in President Kennedy's left leg in the event that he might need blood. So all this is kind of happening at the same time. I'm going kind of sequential because I'm trying to give you names. But you got to remember this is all kind of happening at the same time. And Dr. Ronald Jones had earlier established an IV line in President Kennedy's left leg in case he needed blood. He also inserted a chest tube into the president. This might be you might think it's an easy answer, it's not necessarily. Who comes into Trauma 1 to evaluate the president's condition at this time? Who would be real interested in that other than Jackie? That's a good guess, but not yet. What?
Hill?
No, you think maybe Clint Hill. But actually it was Roy Kellerman, because what's he in charge of? The Secret Service, right? Okay? So he's in charge of every agent in Dallas. So Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, who was in the presidential limousine, the non-driver, went into Trauma 1 to evaluate the president's condition. Once he saw the severity of the president's wounds, he hollered out to other agents and told them to get a telephone line to the White House immediately. So Agent Roy Kellerman goes into Trauma 1. He sees the severity of the president's wounds. He knows what the deal is. And he hollers out to Secret Service agents, somebody get a direct telephone line to the White House. You know who secured the line? Sheriff?
No.
Clint Hill. Clint Hill was the agent that secured the line to the White House from Parkland Hospital. While Clint Hill was talking to the White House on the telephone, he was interrupted by the operator. The operator cut in and interrupted him. And guess who wanted to talk to Clint Hill back in Washington? who interrupted the line and said, "Put Mr. Hill on the line." Robert Kennedy was back in Washington. Robert Kennedy tells the operator to interrupt and to put Agent Hill on the phone because he wanted to talk to him. Here's the conversation between the two. You don't have to write it down, just listen. Robert Kennedy simply asked Agent Hill, "How bad is it?" Agent Hill was later quoted as saying this: "I didn't know what to tell him. I really didn't know what to say. I simply said, it's as bad as it can get." What would you say? I mean, what'd you say to the president's brother? Well, outside the trauma room, Mrs. Kennedy was sitting in a wooden chair, waiting. And a Dallas police sergeant by the name of Robert Bob Duger was sitting next to the First Lady during this time. Mrs. Kennedy sitting now on a wooden chair waiting for news. And Dallas Police Sergeant Robert Bob Duger was sitting near her. And he later stated, quote, "She asked me if I had a cigarette, and I said, 'I'm sorry, but I don't smoke.' She said, 'I have some cigarettes in my purse. Will you get them for me?' One of the Secret Service guys came over and said, 'Get your damn hand out of Mrs. Kennedy's bag.' Mrs. Kennedy put him down pretty quick. So Duger actually got the First Lady a cigarette out of her own purse and gave it to her to calm her nerves. Well, after Dr. Perry's attempt to revive the president, it was obvious that the situation was absolutely fruitless. Finally, Dr. Kemp Clark, this guy right here, steps in. He was the chief of neurosurgery, and he said, quote, "It's time to stop the resuscitation. It is incompatible with life." So officially, President Kennedy was pronounced dead by Dr. Kemp Clark at that point. He said, "It's time to stop the resuscitation. This is incompatible with life." We will talk about this tomorrow. The president will not be officially pronounced dead till 1 p.m. This is well before 1 p.m. Why? He's dead right there. Why aren't they going to officially pronounce him dead? Catholics, he has not been administered the last rites of the Catholic Church. And Mrs. Kennedy is going to want that done, even though he's dead, prior to that being announced. And we'll talk about that tomorrow and what happens at Parkland Hospital after that. Kind of